Hello learners, and welcome to the second lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. I ended the previous lecture with a long quotation from John Gould Fletcher, an American who immigrated to London in search for higher values. I'll briefly gloss that quote and that desire for higher values and move on to the lives and highly successful careers of other writers and poets who made similar migrations and who found similar values. So, what did Fletcher represent actually? Fletcher was not an isolated individual, rather, he represented a wider tendency, a structure of feeling almost, to use a phrase from Raymond Williams. What were the causes of such a structure of feeling? Essentially, people like Fletcher felt the way they did because they experienced a profound alienation from contemporary America. It also came from an uncertain sense of identity and finally also a yearning for permanent aesthetic and spiritual values and a readiness to search for such values in the great centers of European civilization. So you can see from these ideas that it is essentially a very privileged preoccupation. Someone who goes to college at Harvard experiences alienation from contemporary America and wishes to move towards the greater or older centers of European civilization, which they assume is in London. Right? As privileged or as problematic as that may be, it was a thing. It was a fact that many individuals felt this way. They acted according to these feelings, and they ended up producing what today we recognize as modernism. To understand the sense of alienation from contemporary America, we may think about Matthew Arnold's very iconic book, Culture and Anarchy, which was published in the years 1867 and 68. Those of you who have taken my Victorian course will recall that I described this work. And even if you haven't taken that course, you may know of the significance of this work, Culture and Anarchy. Matthew Arnold famously criticized materialism in Victorian or 19th century England. And Arnold pitted religion against economics. And not only religion, but subsequently from religion, he graduated to literature. Writing, narrative, culture took the place or the value, the spiritual power of religion in an increasingly materializing Victorian society. This is essentially what Matthew Arnold did in Culture and Anarchy. While this work was published in the late Victorian era and described the developments in early Victorian England, this work inspired many American writers and thinkers in the later 19th and the early 20th centuries. Essentially, what happened was a lot of American writers and individuals began to feel that they were living through the kind of times that Arnold was describing. So just like Matthew Arnold criticized materialism, rampant materialism in Victorian society, American writers began to feel that they lived in an even more increasingly materializing American society, or an American version of the materialism in Victorian England. And which is also understandable because in the economic history of the world, we know that the 19th century and the 20th centuries were the time when the economic center of the world shifted from London to New York. Right? While London was at the peak of its economic powers in the Victorian era, that was no longer the case in the 20th century. Right? So this shift in the economic centers of the world was mirrored in the kind of alienation that American writers began to feel in America. One example of this can be found in the autobiographical writing of the American writer Sherwood Anderson. Anderson described the years in which he grew up as, and I quote, the most materialistic age in the history of the world, when wars would be fought without patriotism, when men would forget God and only pay attention to moral standards, when the will to power would replace the will to serve, and beauty would be well nigh forgotten in the terrible headlong rush of mankind toward the acquisition of possessions. Right? So it's a very straightforward statement of the ills of materialism, and one can easily note in these words an underlying spiritualism and an underlying value, a moralistic critique of wealth. Right? There were several literary texts that registered and described this form of fear of materialism, this condemnation of materialism. Anderson himself wrote about it in his book, Winesburg, Ohio, which was published in the year 1919. The most powerful and iconic condemnation of materialism that was observed in the late 19th and early 20th century America can be found in the novel The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, in addition to the feelings of writers, feelings of Americans who felt alienated in a rapidly materializing America, there were also some facts. So not only were writers alienated by the accumulation of wealth, that was one motivation for transatlantic migration and modernism, but there was also a somewhat contradictory motivation for the development of modernism. And that was the fact that some of these wealthy patrons, some of these very rich people decided to patronize the arts, decided to support, fund the writing of poetry, the creation of art. And that is also a very, very important historical fact about the development of modernism. It may claim to be a challenge to economics and materialism, but it could not exist without the accumulation of wealth by some individuals. In other words, modernism as an artistic movement, like all artistic movements in all societies, depended very strongly on the patronage of wealthy individuals. And this was a contradiction that some modernist writers chose to ignore, because very few modernist writers actually described the economic origins of their literary and cultural experimentation. So what were these economic origins? The increase in financial and economic prosperity improved transatlantic communication. Technologies like the telegraph and wireless radio accelerated the exchange of ideas. Not just ideas, but the movement of things, commodities, also became faster, easier, cheaper, and more convenient. That is, faster and cheaper shipping made travel to Europe more accessible. Not just people, but things also could move across the Atlantic Ocean. And this movement of people, movement of objects, movement of ideas made possible a vibrant transatlantic literary community. Two very important patrons of this transatlantic literary community were Winifred Elliman and Nancy Cunard. Both of these individuals also happened to be heiresses of wealthy shipping families. This is a key historical fact, and I believe by no means coincidental, that individuals who were able to patronize literary and cultural experimentation were heiresses of shipping families. Right? So they quite literally had accumulated wealth by investing traditionally, ancestrally owned wealth in the movement of commodities, right? In making possible the movement of people faster, that is shipping. And having done that, they made another very important choice, a choice that would be highly beneficial to writers and poets, which is they decided to support literary magazines, publish poets, and so on. In trying to understand these transatlantic connections through the work of individual poets, we can look at the case of Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was an American writer who migrated to England before T.S. Eliot and was in some ways the most representative of a phenomena that the scholar Hugh Kenner has called international modernism. Uh, Modernism began in London. It may be said to be an English phenomena, as if modernism was an individual carrying a British passport. But actually, that is not, in fact, the case. Although modernism began in London, it was put together by Americans. Now, they may later on have become naturalized British citizens and they may have given up their so called American passports, but that happened much later. And at the time of its conception, modernism was a very international phenomenon. Ezra Pound moved to London in December 1908, where he met his idol, the Irish poet William Butler Yeats. In London, Pound supported himself by lecturing at a college, not at a very elite Oxbridge institution, but rather at the somewhat more ordinary Regent Street Polytechnic. The subject of these lectures was early medieval European literature. These lectures were subsequently published by J.M. Dent in a book titled The Spirit of Romance in the year 1910. So you can see how this American writer is hustling his way up the literary pecking order in London, right? By lecturing at a very ordinary, non-elite college, getting those lectures published. This shows a degree of resourcefulness and energy, which which I'm describing using the somewhat non-literary word hustle. But hustle is actually a very good description for what a lot of modernist poets did by advertising the difficulty of modernism as an intellectual value. Ezra Pound was among the earliest writers to do that, but T.S. Eliot continued to do that. Do what? Advertise, describe the virtues of difficulty in his prose, in his reviews, in his lectures, while at the same time, in a parallel line, publishing poetry which may be said to embody those very traits of difficulty. So, what Pound and Eliot were doing effectively was that they were not only writing poetry, but they were also creating a reading public which would be receptive, which would understand, appreciate, and celebrate those particular aspects of their poems which were unique. Right? We'll talk more about this later, but for now, I just want to highlight this. Staying with Ezra Pound's hustle and his movement up the literary pecking order in London, a very important part about Ezra Pound's personal life also is relevant. While in London, Pound met Olivia Shakespeare, the novelist and friend of William Butler Yeats, and the very next year, Pound married Mrs. Shakespeare's daughter, Dorothy Shakespeare, in 1914. And around this time, Pound wrote to another American poet, his friend, William Carlos Williams. And these are the words that Ezra Pound writes. I am by way of falling into the crowd that does things here. And further, Pound writes to William Carlos Williams, London, dear old London, is the place for poesy. Now this phrase, place for poesy, is actually a very telling phrase because it conveys both the opportunity that this immigrant has fought for himself and got for himself, but it also represents how London becomes a place for poesy when an outsider recognizes its literary value. Now, of course, London remains London, whether these words are spoken by Ezra Pound or Eliot or anyone else. But how much London is a place for poesy can be appreciated only by an outsider. And it is these outsiders, like Ezra Pound, who appreciated London's poetic nature, who appreciated what London could really do, all that London could do for an outsider trying to get published. And once they recognized the potential, the power of London in making the career of a poet, that modernism truly began to take wings. Now, like Ezra Pound, there were several others who had a similar trajectory, that is, who migrated to London from America, began a successful career as a poet, and then continued to remain successful based on their experiences in London. Probably the most famous American poet of the 20th century is Robert Frost. And Frost had a career which was uncannily similar to that of Ezra Pound. Frost arrived in England in 1912, having failed to find a publisher in America. And this may be somewhat surprising to those of you who've read and admired Robert Frost's poetry. In my view, Frost is among the most powerful and popular and beloved poets of the 20th century, and yet he had failed to find a publisher until the year 1912. In London, Frost befriended British poets, that is, Edward Thomas and Lascelles Abercrombie, and others from the Georgian school of poets. From these connections, Frost began to get published. The London-based publisher David Nutt agreed to publish Frost's first two books of poems, that is, A Boy's Will and North of Boston. Having got published and having received some successful reviews, Frost's career finally took off. These books were reviewed favorably on both sides of the Atlantic, and American publishers who had earlier refused to take on Frost's work began to take an interest. And when Frost returned to the US in 1915, he was taken up by Henry Holt and Company of New York City. And Henry Holt remained Frost's principal publisher for the rest of his long and what remains to be among the most successful poetic careers of the 20th century. So we can see that even though Frost did not remain in London, like say Pound or others, but it was the power of those few years that Frost spent in London which remained indispensable to his success, to the beginning and the continued success of his career as a poet. Like Frost, there was another American, and actually an American from Pound's city, that is Philadelphia, who later became very, very successful and influential as a British poet. This individual was Hilda Doolittle, famously known as H.D., because that was the pen name with which she published. H.D. and Pound founded a movement called the Imagist movement. This Imagist movement attracted a lot of English poets and translators, among whom were F.S. Flint and Richard Adlington. Adlington later went on to marry H.D. But these three writers, Ezra Pound, Robert Frost, and Hilda Doolittle, describe very powerfully how this London detour, that is, a brief foray, a brief trip of this outsider, an American poet, a brief exposure to the potential, the tradition, the heritage, and the connections that London offered was indispensable to their success as individual poets, but also consolidated and established modernism as a literary and cultural movement. In order to understand the newness of modernist poetry, it's important to recognize what Imagism was and how Imagism builds a bridge from earlier forms of poetry to the 20th century. Imagism is probably the most important single movement in English language poetry of the 20th century. Hardly any prominent poet of Pound's generation and the next two after it went untouched by Imagist theory and practice. The aesthetic of imagism might nowadays be called minimalist. Right? Minimalist is a word that many of you may be familiar with. Minimalist today popularly means using less, doing less, speaking less, writing less. And in the case of poetry, imagism was a kind of minimalist poetry. It used as few words as possible. Imagism emphasized a departure from romanticism, a departure from romantic and Victorian styles of poetry. It emphasized a romantic return to origins, a simplification of needless complexities, a zealous, puritanical stripping away of the excesses of modern poetry. So, what were these excesses? Too many words, too many emotions. All of these things, words and emotions, both complicated things, distracted the reader from what the poet wanted to convey. The words, the rhyming patterns, the stress patterns, all of these external forms of poetry, all of these were seen as excesses. Uh, these were like barnacles that had attached themselves to the clean hull of poetry. So modernist poets wanted to remove all of these distractions, and they wanted to return or to convey to the reader simply the force of an image. What were these luxuries that were to be relinquished? Traditional meter and rhyme, artificial poetic diction, superfluous verbiage, explicit philosophizing and editorializing, rhetoric and transitional filler. The poem was to be made as economical and functional as possible. So, what is the point of a poem in an imagist universe? The point of a poem is to represent images unmediated by authorial commentary, right? Which is a very strange thing to say. How can an author convey an image without commenting on it, without saying something that might distract the reader from the image? Because the image exists in the mind of the poet who has observed something. Nonetheless, these contradictions aside, the encouragement that these poets, Ezra Pound and Hilda Doolittle, gave to other contemporary poets was to simply describe the image and try as much as possible to not over describe the image. And how does one draw the line, a contemporary might ask? How can one describe the image, as Pound and H.D. put it, without distracting the reader from words that the poet might have added? Because ultimately, the poet can only convey the image using words that they have chosen. So it's a somewhat contradictory advice. Nonetheless, it was applied to great success in some poems by these individuals who propounded the theory in the first place. A famous poem by Ezra Pound that is often as an example of imagism is In a Station of the Metro. I will not be quoting from that poem in this lecture, mainly because it's a poem that is very familiar, is quoted everywhere, and it might not be the most useful thing for me to gloss or to give a reading of that poem. Hence, I've chosen a somewhat different poem, a somewhat lesser known poem by Ezra Pound, which is called Papyrus. This poem, Papyrus, consists of only 4 words, 1 word in each line, 2 in the second, so 3 lines, and each line ends with 5 dots. Right? So it's almost as if every line has a word that ends with a trailing set of dots. Right? And the 3 words are spring, too long, and gongula. Now, this poem is purportedly a translation of a Greek lyric. This Greek lyric is partially destroyed, and these are the words that are available. Right? Pound has somehow found, or Pound's poetic persona has found these words and is translating these and transcribing these for the benefit of the reader. This Greek lyric is accidentally and only partially preserved on a recycled manuscript. And so the challenge then becomes in how few words can the essence of a poem, a love poem, by the Greek poet Sappho, be conveyed. Now, in theme and form, the poem enacts a drama of presence and absence. The presence of spring whets Sappho's appetite for the absent Gongula. The presence of three line beginnings whets our appetite for an absent text. By honing language's presence to an absolute minimum, the Images poem sharpens our intuition of its expressive gaps and omissions. Seeing these words again, the very lack of words encourages the imagination of the reader, enables us to understand what Pound means by the word image. The image is not a realized image, the image is not detailed, rather, the image is only hinted at. So, when Pound or HD ask their contemporary poets to not over describe the image, they are assuming that it is impossible to describe the image in words. Rather, what they are asking from other practitioners is to invite readers into an act of very engaged, interested, sensitive, empathetic imagination. Right? These words invite us to imagine a reality. These words assume that we cannot see what the poet sees, and yet, through the poet's use of certain words, very carefully chosen, we can inhabit that space of longing. We can inhabit that space of intellectual and emotional curiosity. And once we inhabit that space, we can share what the poet wants us to think about and understand. And finally, if we are sharing some of that, we are experiencing something of the wonder and joy that the poet is experiencing. In this case, Ezra Pound is experiencing the wonder of how Sappho described her longing for someone. I'll briefly quote from Pound, where Pound defines what an image means. Pound defines an image thus: an image presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. So, from a spatial or a visual metaphor, we are getting a temporal metaphor. An image is not what's something that one sees. Rather, an image is an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. An image is not a picture of a reality that is observed by the eye. Rather, an image is a snapshot of the intellectual map of a poet at an instant of time. At a particular time, the poet experiences something, and the connections that that experience creates in their mind, all the ideas, all the emotions that are going through the poet at a particular time, a snapshot of those connections. That is what Pound defines as an image, and that is what a poem should try to convey, using very few words. The movement Imagism was joined and in some ways rivaled by many other movements, and one of those very important movements was Vorticism. Poets such as Wyndham Lewis, Amy Lowell, etc., came together and began to publish imagistic work, which attracted some degree of anger and frustration from Ezra Pound, who began to feel his power challenged. Therefore, Pound broke off from this group and designed another movement called Vorticism. The key journal of this movement, the Vorticist movement, was Blast. I mentioned this simply to illustrate that T.S. Eliot, who is arguably the most famous poet of the 20th century, published some of his early work in this Vorticist journal. And it was the work done in terms of immigration, in terms of writing, reading, in terms of building networks by Ezra Pound and Hilda Doolittle, which set the stage for T.S. Eliot to do the work that he did. Right? I will stop here. I hope that I have conveyed a powerful sense of the transatlantic connections in 20th century poetry. In the next lecture, we will briefly discuss the work of William Butler Yeats and focus on a particular poem of his, which is The Lake Isle of Innisfree. Thank you, and I look forward to the next lecture.